Hi everybody, Peter Greenberg here. It's now Wednesday, February 19th, with an update on that terrible crash in Toronto of the Delta Airlines CRJ 900 on its flight from Minneapolis to Toronto. On Monday, this is what we thought we knew. We didn't have all the access to the additional video that's now become available. But on Monday, we knew it was a hard landing. We thought the plane had sort of essentially cartwheeled or bounced up and then became inverted. What we do know now, thanks to a video that was taken by a pilot who was on the ground showing the landing configuration of that plane in real time, was that the plane did not bounce, but what it did do is it smashed into the ground at a very high rate, collapsing the right landing gear, causing an initial fire as the wing broke off of the plane. It then slid along the runway and then somehow rolled over in a perfectly even inverted way. The really question is, why did it slam into the ground at that speed and at that particular location? This is also how much we know. If you take a look at that video, you will see that the pilot, or whoever was in control of that plane, either the pilot or co-pilot, did not flare like you would normally do on a landing. On a normal landing, you come down like this, and at the last minute, you flare landing gear, main landing gear, and then down on your nose gear. This did not happen this time. It just came down like that. And when that happened, the force was enough to apparently crush the main landing gear, and the rest, as we know, happened as you saw it on the screen. So what could have caused that? We know there were wind gusts in the area, but we don't know exactly the velocity at that moment yet or the direction. There's also a possibility of low-level wind shear. What is wind shear? If you're flying against, let's say, a headwind at a certain knot, and all of a sudden that velocity of the headwinds against you drops out, you sink down. And as any pilot of a jet plane will tell you, it takes a while to spool up the engines to give you enough throttle to be able to do a go-around. He had no chance to do that. So they're looking at that as well. Now, the National Transportation Safety Board will be investigating this, but they're not the lead. It's the Canadian Accident Investigation Board. The local investigation board always takes the lead, but they reached out to the NTSB. And here's the good news for investigators as we know now. They have an amazing amount of hard and reliable data. They were able to secure the cockpit voice recorder, which will give them the last 30 minutes of conversation both in and from the cockpit. Also, the recordings of the air traffic control tower to that plane and other pilots in the area who may have been reporting either gusted winds, wind shear, or turbulence. They were also able to retrieve the flight data recorder, which is in the tail, which, as you can see from all the videos, disappeared. It basically got mangled when that plane inverted, but they've got it. And both of those devices have been taken back to the lab for downloading and analysis. So between that, the video, and one other crucial element, at least 80 eyewitnesses who saw, witnessed, or experienced this from different perspectives and positions, the investigators will be able to establish a second-by-second timeline correlating the radio transmissions with the actual performance of the plane, the actual conditions on the ground and in the air, and we should find out within a relatively short period of time, at least on a preliminary basis, not only what happened, but why it happened. And then, of course, comes the hard work. The recommendations that the Accident Investigation Board, in this case in Canada, would make to their version of the Department of Transportation, although I suspect the US NTSB will do the same thing for our Department of Transportation with urgent safety recommendations that of the lessons learned, how do we apply them and make sure that this incident doesn't happen again. That's really the role of the NTSB. The role of the FAA, which I have questioned for 40 years, is how fast they will move to implement those suggestions, especially if those suggestions include a solution that can be easily implemented. It's not a question of cost, it's a question of doing the right thing. It's not a question of cost, it's a question of worth. And the problem with the FAA is based on the way it was originally chartered by Congress, they tend to fall on the side of the airlines or the manufacturers in terms of economic impact anytime they're given a safety recommendation. Why is that? Because when they were established by an act of Congress back in 1935, 90 years ago, they were given a dual mandate that's impossible to perform. Now, the first part of the mandate, I think we can also embrace, we can all embrace and support, and that is to enact and enforce safety regulations. So far, so good. The second part of that mandate is what troubles everybody, and that is to quote unquote promote the business of aviation. Hey, you can't do both. That's a built-in conflict of interest. Remember, if you know there's a problem and you say we're going to investigate, that's fair. That's what's happening now, right? The NTSB and their Canadian counterpart are doing just that. But let's say you investigate and you find out what happened. You not only find out why, but you can figure out a solution that if you use that solution, it won't happen again. And let's say that solution is available and you can implement that solution. If you then, this is what gets to the FAA, if you then, as a regulator, make the conscious decision not to implement that solution, doesn't that define criminal negligence? That's what we don't want to have happen here. It's happened so many times in the past where they had a problem, they had a solution, and then they chose not to implement it. By the way, not just in air safety, remember the 25% plug in the Ford Pinto gas tank? Same deal. Ford didn't want to spend the 25 cents. And look what happened to how many people lost their lives when that gas tank exploded. So that's where we are in the investigation. But the good news here, more than any other recent accident, is there are a lot of eyes on this plane. There are a lot of eyes on the video. There are a lot of eyes in the cabin and in the cockpit, and they all survived. So one by one, each will be interviewed. The Canadian version of the NTSB will have their own go teams there. They will follow engine performance, fuel, weather, materials. They'll follow human factors, pilot training. They'll even want to know what the pilots had for breakfast that day. It'll get that specific to see what may have contributed and what didn't. Remember, they're going to have to rule everything out before they can rule any one thing in, but they're well on the way to do that. And as this story continues, we've been able to eliminate, for example, that the plane, we thought it bounced, it didn't bounce. We heard a story that the pilot may have had problems with his flaps and didn't extend them. We'll find that out pretty soon. We'll be able to confirm that one way or the other. And that will allow us to look at the speed of the plane. How fast was he flying when he hit? How far over the runway threshold was he when he hit? And of course, then, was that plane performing outside of its performance limitations in terms of the available wind that was on the ground that was either coming at him or as a crosswind? All that's going to be covered in the days and weeks ahead, but if any history is any indication, we're going to find out relatively soon here what happened, how it happened, and why it happened. And most importantly, and that's when it gets into the regulatory agencies, what are we going to do about it? Again, for those people who are worried about flying right now, this incident has no connection whatsoever with the mid-air collision at Washington Reagan, the crash of the medical jet in Philadelphia, or the runway incursion, if you will, of the Learjet in Scottsdale. 4 separate incidents, 4 separate reasons, 4 separate sets of context, none of which are connected. So I'll be on a plane tomorrow, so will you. We're going to be fine, but that doesn't stop us from trying to find out what happened, why it happened, and then what needs to be done. I'll be in touch.